And so one of the things that I've called for is creating what I call a Washington Corrupt Practices Act, which would be mirrored on the foreign corrupt practices.
Welcome to another Capital Tiger Bay Club. I'm Gil Ziffer. I'm going to be presiding today. I'm going to do the best job I can. Sitting next to Morgan is our county commissioner and past president of the National Association of Counties, Brian Deloge. Brian has served our community and our state and our country well, and we're extremely appreciative to have him with us today. Brian is also the only one in elected local office still on Marion Hammer's Christmas card list. We think, maybe. Brian will be providing a Tiger Bay introduction for our featured speaker today. Brian, come on up.
All right, let's go. So we're excited today. Our speaker today is Peter Schweizer. Peter moved to Tallahassee at the height of the Republican Revolution, 1994. And in 34 years, he's accomplished me. That's it. One complete revolution. So Peter, thanks for that. In all fairness, he has had national impact. His book has been panned in 60 Minutes, The Times, NPR, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, etc., etc. He spent his entire career investigating the ways public officials use higher office to benefit their friends and families. So I imagine he lives in Tallahassee not only because of the low taxes and the excellent government representation, but because of the celebrity magnet that Tallahassee is. It's also been reported that he himself has massive net worth and is living a luxurious life like any Hollywood celebrity, possessing luxury goods such as yachts and airplanes, stocks and properties. My bet is his mega yacht is at the St. Mark's Marina as we speak. His next book, Extortion, detailed how elected officials can leverage their influence over industries to extort campaign donations or other lifestyle subsidies. Not that anyone here knows anything about that. Again, he lives here. Coincidence? I think not. We know you are well acquainted with our recent speaker, Peter, Roger Stone. We're privileged to see a large photo of Roger's back tattoo, along with a real-life view of John Daly's back tattoo. But John, not before lunch, please. So, most people are attending the meeting today hoping that you will show us your back tattoo. So, and then his most recent book, which actually is pretty amazing, is Clinton Cash. It's credited with launching several FBI investigations into the Clinton Foundation and helping elect Donald Trump. So basically, everything you're tired of hearing about on the news today is his fault. So please help me welcome Peter Schweizer.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate that. I got together with a friend that I hadn't seen since college about 3 or 4 months ago, and we were talking about our various career paths, and he said, yeah, I noticed that you were doing all these sort of things, and then you kind of veered off into exposing corruption and cronyism in politics. What's that all about? And I just shrugged my shoulders and said, job security, right? It's not going to prove anytime soon. But seriously, it's great to be here. I've been here several times before, and I always enjoy it. And I wanted to talk to you today about a new form of corruption that's occurring. A lot of us are familiar with what I regard as the traditional form of corruption, which was personified perhaps by the former Congressman William Jefferson. You guys remember William Jefferson? He's the guy that had the $90,000 cash in his freezer and got the nickname Cold Hard Cash Jefferson. That was the old form of corruption. He made the mistake of taking a bribe and payoff and keeping the money. What I want to talk to you about a little bit today are the new forms of corruption. It involves a lot larger sums of money. It involves more nefarious people than we think of in the past. And it's harder and harder to detect, which is what makes it so dangerous. In fact, the reason that I titled the new book Secret Empires is precisely because we have elected officials in Washington, D.C. who have amassed large financial fortunes through their families' deals while they're in public service, but it doesn't show up in their disclosure forms because of the way they structure those deals. Now, before I get into giving you some examples, and by the way, this is a problem involving both Republicans and Democrats, let me preface this the way I preface every speech. There are good people in public service. There are good people in elected office. I never want to create the impression to everyone that there is nobody in Washington, D.C. that isn't doing any good. That is simply not the case. The debate, of course, is which represents the majority side, and I have pretty strong opinions about that, but maybe we can talk about that in the question and answer period. But let me talk to you about the new corruption, and let me tell you a story to sort of set the stage. Go back to December of 2013. It's the Obama administration. Joe Biden is the Vice President of the United States, and he takes a trip on Air Force Two to Beijing, China. Now, on the agenda are a series of very, very sensitive deals and subjects, as you can imagine. First of all, the Chinese government has exerted territorial control over the South China Sea. They did this because they want to get access to the minerals and the natural resources that are in the seabed. But by doing so, they essentially said, this part of the ocean is ours. We don't care what anybody else in the region says. And so you can imagine that power grab was very disconcerting to a lot of people. That was on the agenda. There were, of course, the persistent trade issues between the United States and China that was on the trade agenda. Tech transfer issues, North Korea, China's growing military power. These were all the sensitive issues that Joe Biden was expected to deal with on this trip, at least in some way. Now, on the plane with him, on Air Force Two with him, was his son, Hunter Biden. This is not the son that tragically passed away from brain cancer. This is the other son, Hunter Biden. And he flew with his father on Air Force Two to Beijing, where his father was meeting with Chinese officials. Over a 3-day period, we generally know what Joe Biden was doing because it was a public agenda. We know very little of what Hunter Biden was doing. But it became pretty clear 10 days after they returned from Beijing, China on Air Force Two. Because that's the day that Hunter Biden's firm scored a $1 billion, that's with a B, private equity deal with the Chinese government. Now, this is not a Chinese company that has government ties. This is not an American company doing business in China. This is, in fact, the Chinese government. Now, what's curious about this, of course, is the timing. But it gets even more curious when you look and see about the firm that Hunter Biden was running. It's called Rosemont Seneca Partners. It had been set up and half funded by a guy named Chris Hines, who is the stepson of John Kerry, who at this time was the Secretary of State. And the third person involved with Rosemont Seneca Partners is a guy named Devin Archer, who was a former fundraiser for John Kerry. So this deal that the Chinese government decided to provide $1 billion for involved the son of the vice president, the son of the Secretary of State, and a former close aide to the Secretary of State. By the way, these three individuals, they had no background in private equity, they had no background in China whatsoever. But that was only the first of 3 deals. Imagine this for a second, 3 deals that the family members of these 2 individuals would secure with the Chinese government as their fathers were negotiating with that same Chinese government. They set up something called the Rosemont Opportunities Fund. You wonder when you look at the title whose opportunity we're talking about here. But a Chinese government entity named Gemini, which by the way is close to the Chinese Navy, provided $38 million to Rosemont Opportunities Fund. And then there was another element, another company called Rosemont Realty, to which the Chinese government entity Gemini bought 75% of, and then committed to putting $3 billion of more equity in. So during this period from 2013 to 2016, when America's leading diplomats are supposed to be negotiating in good faith, challenging the efforts of the Chinese government to exert its authority in the world, the sons of those chief diplomats are scoring lucrative deals with the Chinese government. Now, lest Republicans in the room get too comfortable, this just does not involve Joe Biden. Let me now switch to another powerful figure, two powerful figures in Washington, D.C. in Republican Party circles, and that would be Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and his wife, Elaine Chao. Because just like Joe Biden's son inked a deal with the Chinese government, the McConnell-Chao family was happy to do the same with the Chinese government. And it basically happened this way. Mitch McConnell, a senator elected in the mid-1980s from the state of Kentucky, marries Elaine Chao, who was in the Reagan administration. And in 1993, they get married, and at the end of that year, Mitch McConnell takes a trip to Beijing, China with his new father-in-law, James Chao. Now, this is not an official Senate trip. This is not a US government trip. This is a trip that is sponsored by the China State Shipbuilding Corporation, CSSC. As the name implies, this is a Chinese government entity, and all you really need to know about the CSSC is it's one of the largest military contractors in China. And what the Chinese government says to Mitch McConnell and his father-in-law is, you know what? We would like to set you guys up in the shipping business. You've got this small shipping company called the Foremost Group. You've got about half a dozen ships. We would like to build all your new ships. We would like to finance the construction of those ships. We'll provide the crews for those ships, and we'll provide the contracts where you will ship goods from one of our Chinese government-owned companies to another, and you'll make a lot of money. And the McConnell-Chao family said, sounds like a good deal to us. And so today, looking ahead, woe these 24 years later, the Foremost Group doesn't have 6 ships. It has about 36 ships, and it's enormously profitable. And along the way, James Chao, his father-in-law, was so happy that Mitch McConnell was his son-in-law that he gave the senator a gift of between $5 million and $25 million. Now, this by itself may seem curious, but it becomes increasingly troubling when you look at what has happened to Mitch McConnell's position on China over the course of the last 24 years. Because you see, in December of 1993, when he went to Beijing, up until that point, he was very hawkish on China. He was critical about them for human rights. He was probably the most outspoken senator as it came to the Tiananmen Square massacre that occurred in 1988. He was somebody who was very concerned about the transfer of Hong Kong to mainland China, and he was very concerned about China's military expansion. 24 years later, you will find none of that on Mitch McConnell's record. And what you're seeing in both the case of the Bidens and the McConnell-Chao family is something very simple. The Chinese have erected a strategy whereby they believe, and they've had success with this, that they can essentially buy off portions of America's political leadership by giving sweetheart deals to the family members of American politicians. And here's why the book is titled Secret Empires. If you look at Joe Biden's financial disclosure forms, if you look at Mitch McConnell or Elaine Chao's financial disclosure forms, you will find no mention of any of these deals. Think about this for a second. They are required to disclose a $5,000 campaign contribution. They are required to disclose a $5,000 investment if they own GE stock. But they are not required to disclose if an adult child has a $1 billion deal with a foreign government, or if their family has a cozy commercial deal with the Chinese government. That is one of the great problems with corruption in Washington, D.C. today. Let me talk to you about a second form of corruption that is increasingly growing, and then I'd love to open it up for questions, because I always love the questions that I get from this group. We think of crony capitalism and we think of issues related to that kind of behavior through a very direct prism. That is that the government is going to give certain subsidies to certain businesses, they're going to give certain contracts to certain businesses to try to curry favor. That is the traditional form of crony capitalism. What we've seen emerge in the last 8 to 10 years is what we call smash and grab. Now, if you had asked me 2 years ago how I would assess the Obama administration as it relates to financial corruption, I would give it pretty good marks, right? You didn't have a lot of cases involving direct financial corruption. I would say today that I was precisely wrong, especially when you look at what's going on in the area of smash and grab. Now, as the name implies, there's a process here. And the process is probably best demonstrated with another story. And this relates to a gentleman named Marty Nesbitt. Now, people here that have not read the book, has anybody here ever heard of Marty Nesbitt before? All right, we see a couple of hands go up. Marty Nesbitt was and is Barack Obama's best friend. And there's no debate about that. That's what President Barack Obama said. That's what all of his close friends said. But very few people know about Marty Nesbitt. But after Barack Obama was reelected in November 2012, Marty Nesbitt set up a private investment fund called Vistria Partners. And if you look at the corporate documents and the investment portfolio, they describe the business model as thus. We are going to invest in highly regulated industries. Now, that may seem a little bit spurious as an investment model, except when you remember the fact that Marty Nesbitt's best friend at this time is the regulator-in-chief. And smash and grab worked spectacularly. So let me give you one example. University of Phoenix, a for-profit school that a lot of people may be familiar with. They have campuses around the country. They have online courses. And it was a for-profit university, still is today. And the Obama administration decided that they didn't like the University of Phoenix. It wasn't serving students well in their minds, even though students gave it high marks, and a lot of employers said that people came well-trained when they went to the University of Phoenix. So the Obama administration said, we are going to suspend and stop money from the GI Bill from going to the University of Phoenix. That is, current active duty soldiers or soldiers that have left the military that are under the GI Bill can no longer take money and use it at the University of Phoenix. Well, you can imagine what happened to the stock price of the University of Phoenix. It went from about $100 a share down to $8 a share. That's the smash. What happens next is quite curious, because an individual steps forward to say, you know what, I'm going to buy the University of Phoenix. And his name is Marty Nesbitt. Marty Nesbitt buys it for $8 a share, takes it private, at which point the Obama administration has a change of heart and says, you know what, maybe we will allow GI Bill dollars to flow to the University of Phoenix again, thereby raising its valuations. That's just one example of a broad pattern of companies and industries that were smashed during the Obama years. But when you look at those valuations drop, and they're now suddenly worth pennies on the dollar, a small knit group of personal friends of Barack Obama would step in, buy them for pennies on the dollar, and then the regulatory weight on those companies would be lifted. Hence the strategy of smash and grab. This, to me, represents another future trend. It could be a president that does it. It could be a commerce secretary that does it. It could be an EPA regulator that does it. And the reason that this, I believe, is going to become increasingly popular is, like the China examples that I gave you, they're very hard to detect. It's very hard to determine because there's actually no direct, government loan or government contract that you could point to identify at that point in time that a company is being given a favor. So this represents the kind of challenge that we are facing going forward. Now, what I hear from a lot of people a lot of times is, this is great, Peter, you've made me angry, you've frustrated me, but what can we actually do about this? And I think there are actually a couple of things that we can do, and I'm actually somewhat optimistic that we can get there. The first thing I can say is, as it relates to Secret Empires, is the response has been tremendous. The book came out 4 weeks ago. We debuted at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. There's been massive interest on Capitol Hill. Met with several U.S. senators, met with members of the House Oversight Committee, where there are plans to hold hearings and investigations on these matters. Those are all very encouraging. But here is what I think we need to do as citizens, and I've mentioned this to you before. None of this is going to be dealt with so long as people adopt the policy and the posture of saying, I'm mad about the other side's ethics, but I'm not going to call out my own. And so what I would suggest today is if you are in here and you like Joe Biden, and you think Joe Biden's a good idea because you like his policy stance, I would challenge you to say this is not acceptable behavior, and I'm going to let him know about it, or if he runs for office again, I'm going to let him know about it. Because my contention to you would be there are other alternatives. You do not have to pick a corrupt person to support for office. Republicans, I would say the same thing. Those people on your side of the aisle that are engaged in this kind of behavior, if they run for office, if they are seeking office, or they're seeking to raise money from you, you need to call them out. It's only when you have a zero tolerance policy for your own side is this behavior going to be dealt with. Because here's what they're counting on. They're counting on the binary divide that exists in the country today, where we're basically 50% Democrat, 50% Republican, and both sides are so paranoid about the other side getting a slight advantage that both sides are prepared to stick with people and individuals who've been engaging in financial corruption while they've been in elected office. And that has got to be dealt with, and the only way it's going to change is if people are prepared to call out their own side. And with that, I'll say thank you very much, and I'd love to take questions and comments that people might have.